Ahoy hoy, I'm Planetwalk, and it's been a while since the last video. And there's been a video that I've been wanting to respond to for a while. That's why I haven't been making videos lately. I chose a rather inconvenient time to decide to sleep during the night, like a normal person. Well, that, and there's been a whole lot of other problems, such as the internet not working, for example. Anyway, in today's video, we're going to take a look at Apologetics Squared, responding to me, responding to them. But before we get into it, I want to play a small part of their video that I really liked.
And yes, I know that I just described the gambler's fallacy. I just prefer to explain my reasoning rather than just say, oh, this is a fallacy.
Okay, I am a huge fan of this. I really think that simply labeling things as a fallacy and moving on is unhelpful. If you think someone's reasoning went wrong somewhere, explain how you think it went wrong. I'm very happy that Planer intentionally chose to do that here.
So the reason why I like that is because I really do like when people give credit where credit is due. It helps me know that they're engaging in good faith. So many times you will have people that will disagree for the sake of disagreeing, and I don't think that they're really there to have a discussion. So I do respect Apologetics Squared for that. That being said, I am still going to criticize this video.
I want to first clear up a misconception that Planer appears to have had about my original video. Planer seems to have thought that my video was just about the Kalam. This is false. My video was actually about a family of arguments called the Cosmological arguments. The Kalam is indeed a cosmological argument, but Planer didn't realize I had changed which argument I was talking about. He thought I was talking about the Kalam the whole time, and I was just using the term necessary being interchangeably with the cause of the universe. Here's the clip of him saying this explicitly.
Anyway, that's it for this video. I was hoping to hear some arguments as to why the cause, or necessary being as he puts it, must have a mind or must be a god.
So, to clear things up, Kalam is about the cause of the universe, contingency argument is about a necessary being. Coolio.
So my confusion for this is mostly because of the term necessary being. What exactly is a necessary being? For what it's necessary for, food is necessary for survival, for example. That is a necessary being to survive. Now, if the universe has a necessary being, well, what do we mean by that? Well, it means that for the universe to be a thing, there must be something that exists in order for that to happen. I would say that it's the universe, and that's not really a very satisfying answer to a lot of people. In fact, some people would say that that's a circular answer. But I'd say that it's better than trying to invoke something that isn't a part of the universe, therefore we can't detect it or measure it in any way, to explain why the universe keeps on being a universe. However, all this argument makes a whole lot more sense when you invoke time, because now the universe as it is reliant on what it was, and you can follow it back. Actually, you can follow it back pretty far to the Big Bang, and then you can say, well, what caused the Big Bang? Now, we don't actually know the answer to that question, but that is a far more interesting question than trying to say, why does the universe keep on universing? I mean, the question of why does the universe keep on universing is an interesting question, but we can only find answers for that within the universe. I don't think we can really invoke anything other than the universe to answer that. But you'll notice that by going back to the Big Bang, we've essentially arrived at the Kalam cosmological argument again. And that is probably why it's a very popular argument used by theists. Anyway, if there's something that I've completely missed about the contingency argument, feel free to let me know because I'm not too familiar with it.
Just by the thumbnail, I thought, oh, this looks like a Minute Earth video, so I clicked on it, and it turns out that it wasn't.
I'm unfamiliar with this channel, but I don't see the resemblance.
Well, that came from my brain going, well, stick figure, white background, minute physics, but physics doesn't really talk about God, so maybe Minute Earth. But now that you pointed out, I'm going to opt for Professor Stick in disguise. You can't fool me with that squarehead, I'm onto you.
It's when you try and say that that cause must have been God that you run into issues. But I'm sure that Apologetics Squared will give a good justification for why that cause has to be God, right?
To clarify, the point of my video was not actually to defend a particular Stage 2 or Stage 1 case for some cosmological argument, as you yourself acknowledge. Rather, it was to show that cosmological arguments count as evidence for theism as soon as the Stage 1 is complete.
Now, I will be honest, I was hoping that if a response was made, that I'd get some kind of stage 2 stuff. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten that. To tear into that kind of stuff would be far more entertaining.
The way I prefer to argue that God exists is by raising theism's probability step by step with multiple independent arguments, rather than with one knockdown argument. Well, except for psychophysical harmony and nomological arguments, they're knockdown arguments, but like besides those ones.
Okay, so what he's talking about here is essentially how evidence works. You can't actually prove anything, you can only give enough evidence to persuade people. To give an example that people in my audience might be familiar with, I cannot actually prove that the Earth is a globe, but I can give a lot of evidence to the point where it would be stupid to believe that the Earth is not a globe. And no matter how much evidence you give that you think is absolutely foolproof, that nobody would be able to deny it, there will be a fool out there ready to deny it. And there are people that have supposed knockdown arguments that aren't as good as they think, like flat earthers have the black swan, for example.
Now it's time for the real meat and potatoes of the video.
Cool. I'm just a little bit concerned about the vegetarians. Are they going to be mad about this?
Otherwise, you could claim that literally anything is just evidence of whatever you say it's evidence for. For example, I could say that we both live in a time where I exist. Therefore, that's evidence that I am God. You see how that's a non sequitur?
Funnily enough, I disagree. First, what is evidence? I think the best definition of evidence is this. If a fact raises the probability of your theory, then this fact is evidence of your theory. Now, does the mere existence of someone raise the probability that they're a god, even if by a minuscule amount? Well, yes, technically.
Okay, so this is something that we are going to disagree on, because if I say that I'm a god, yes, that has a higher probability of being true than if I say that a pink unicorn that lives with me is a god. However, just because there's evidence for my existence and no evidence for the pink unicorn's existence, doesn't mean that that's evidence for me being a god. That is because the claim that I exist and the claim that I am a god are two separate claims. However, I will appreciate if you start worshipping me. It's a little bit hard to say that I'm a god when I've got nobody worshipping me.
Now, none of this is me trying to nitpick what Planer is saying. If I wanted to nitpick, I'd point out that if a pixie is invisible, then by definition, it's not green. No, rather, I'm just using this example in order to illustrate the conception of evidence that I'm using.
Okay, so one of the first hurdles that we've got is we do disagree on what constitutes evidence. To me, evidence is something that has been shown to be true that follows as a consequence of a hypothesis. Me existing is not evidence that I am God because it is not actually a consequence of that hypothesis. I would exist regardless of whether I'm God or not. Or at least I hope that I'd still exist if I wasn't God.
With the contingency argument, showing that theism better predicts a necessary being than the negation of theism is really easy because the existence of a necessary being is baked into theism, so to speak.
I really think Apologetics Squared needs to define what a necessary being is. Because if we're operating on different definitions, we cannot have a conversation about it.
The Kalam is different though. The fact that the universe began to exist and has a cause is not just baked into theism the way a necessary being is. One might ask, for example, can God create an eternal, beginningless, infinitely old universe? If so, then what's the probability that God would create a finitely old universe that began to exist, rather than an infinitely old universe that did not begin to exist? You need to give arguments that the probability that God would create a finitely old universe is higher given theism than the probability of a finitely old universe given naturalism.
Okay, so there is a slight problem here, and that's one of the contentions that many people have against the Kalam. Theism doesn't posit a lot. It only posits one thing, that there is a god or gods. Likewise, naturalism doesn't posit a lot. All it posits is that there is no supernatural beings. So it's very difficult to ascertain what the probability is of the universe having a beginning, given either of these things. Now you could posit a particular flavour of theism, like Christianity, let's say, or paganism, or Islam, whatever one you choose. The problem is that when you do posit a particular flavour, there are a whole lot of other things that we can test as well. Yes, Christianity does predict that the universe has a beginning, but it also makes some other incorrect predictions, like the sun and the stars, for example, being created after the Earth. Now, you could not argue for a particular flavour of theism and just go, well, there is a God, we just don't know anything about it. But I'd say that that's pretty meaningless. Like, what does this God do? How can we even test for this God if we don't know anything about it? Would this God even create a universe? Can this God even create a universe? Or did the universe create this God?
Okay, here's where I'd get into the problem that I have with astrology. Because astrology is really good at predicting certain things about people. Except that those things are so vague that of course it's going to predict things about people. However, that is not evidence for astrology. For it to be evidence for astrology, you need to show that those predictions are meaningful.
Okay, firstly, I want to make sure that we mean the same thing by prediction. When I say that proposition T predicts proposition E, I mean that the probability of E is high given T, or conditionalized on T. I don't just mean something said about the future.
Okay, I agree, but I'd like to also add something. You cannot predict something that you already know. Like, if I predict that this video here is going to start with a hoi hoi, well, I've already recorded that bit, so it's not really a prediction. I already know what's happening. The reason for this is because it's fairly easy to make something that fits the data rather than something that predicts the data. And whilst that is fine under certain contexts, you can't then say, well, my theory matches the data, so therefore all these other things that my theory says must also be true.
I want to offer an account of when a prediction is meaningful, so that I could show that yes, cosmological arguments do in fact make meaningful predictions in their stage 1. Well, for a proposition to meaningfully predict some event, the event in question has to be intrinsically improbable. As an example, let's say I claim to know the future, and I start making predictions. If I correctly predict that the sun will rise tomorrow, that's not a meaningful prediction, because before I made the prediction, the probability of the sun rising tomorrow is already virtually 100%. But if I correctly predict that the winning lottery numbers tomorrow are, I don't know, say 7, 31, 82, 4, and 78, that's a meaningful prediction, because the probability that those specific numbers would be chosen in the lottery is really small.
Okay, there's an important distinction to make between vague and probable. So if something is probable, then it's likely to occur. If I drop this, then it's probably going to fall. And it did. However, if your prediction is vague, then you can take an event that is fairly unlikely and say that you predicted it. Astrology is actually really good at this because the predictions made by astrology are so vague that something really unlikely can seem like it was accurately predicted by astrology. This can give the impression that astrology predicts really unlikely things, even though that's not the case. Now, I agree that the predictions made by astrology are very likely, but they are also really vague, which makes them seem like they're making a less likely prediction than what they are. It is a trap that a lot of people fall into, and it is more of a problem with how our brains work rather than anything else, but you still need to be careful of it.
Is theism's prediction of a universe that began to exist a meaningful prediction? Well, given the account of meaningfulness I outlined earlier, we need to ask, is the beginning of the universe intrinsically improbable? Well, here's one argument to that effect. Every moment of time that anyone has ever observed in their lives was always preceded by another moment. For every day that any human has ever lived, there was always a yesterday. But what theism predicts is that there was one moment that was unlike all the other moments, the first moment. There were no moments before it. So everyone who says the universe began to exist is making a very weird claim, an intrinsically improbable claim. So if you can run a successful stage 1 argument of the Kalam, you've shown that theism has made a meaningful prediction.
Except you run into the issue that I was just talking about, because yes, the universe having a beginning does seem pretty unlikely. However, how well does theism actually predict that? If we go by Christianity, it says that God created the heavens and the earth, and that seems to be, fairly accurate, right? I mean, we had the Big Bang, and over time the stars were formed and the earth was formed. Accurate, right? Except the phrase, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, it doesn't actually have to refer to the Big Bang. You can just apply it to when the earth was formed. That would still be a valid interpretation of the phrase. especially given that there has been more time in the universe where the Earth hasn't existed than when the Earth has existed. I'm not expecting the Bible to be super accurate and go, in the beginning, God created the universe, then waited 9 billion years, and then created the Earth. If it had been something like, in the beginning, God created the heavens, but they felt empty, so created the Earth, that would have been a far better way to predict the beginning of the universe. Whilst it would still be open to interpretation, it would be far less open to interpretation.
Likewise, for the contingency argument, no object in any everyday human experience is self-existent, so it's meaningful that theism correctly predicts such a being.
Except the problem there is, whilst yes, there are no self-existent objects, there are other objects in existence. For example, I as a person don't exist independently of everything else. There are lots of other things that affect my life. But there are other things that affect my life. Because nothing exists independently of anything else, I don't need to invoke a supernatural being because those things are not self-existent already without a supernatural being. Also, the observation that nothing is self-existent is sort of an observation that anybody can make. So if we do say that the universe needs a necessary being because of that, saying that the necessary being is God is not a prediction. It'd be like saying that theism predicts that humans have morality. But here's the thing, we know that humans have morality before we even get started on the argument of theism. So in this case, we're not making a prediction, we're proposing an explanation.
One final note, I'm kind of confused why other religions were brought up when the topic before us is bare theism.
The reason for that is because theism itself doesn't actually say a lot. It's the religions that add the flavour to it. Theism doesn't say whether a god created the universe. The religions do. Theism doesn't say how many gods there are. It's the religions that do.
Anyways, moving on. Now, theism posits that there's a god who is, amongst other things, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and exists necessarily.
See, that's something that theism doesn't actually posit. It's the religions that posit that. Theism only posits that there is a god or gods. There are certainly theists out there, like pagans, who do not believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful god.
It doesn't matter that a necessary being is logically consistent with other worldviews. As long as the probability of a necessary being, given these alternatives to theism, is less than 100%, the probability of theism will go up.
That is not how it works at all. The probability of theism being true remains the same regardless of whether any other worldview predicts a necessary being.
This is incorrect. Say there are 3 murder suspects, Adam, Bob, and Charlie. Based on the evidence, they are all equally likely suspects. So the probability that, say, Adam is the murderer is 1 in 3. But then we get some evidence that proves Charlie is not the murderer. Well, now the probability that Adam is the murderer has gone up to 1 in 2. Similarly, if we get some evidence that doesn't completely prove that Charlie's innocent, it just lowers the probability that Charlie is the murderer to, say, 10%, this will still directly increase the probability that Adam is the murderer, from 33% to 45%. Bringing this back to theism, if we could disprove alternatives to theism, or even just make the alternatives less probable, this will still increase the probability of theism.
Okay, so the big difference here is that there are infinite alternatives to theism. If there were infinite murder suspects, the probability that Adam is the murderer doesn't go down when you knock off 1 murder suspect, because there's an infinite number of murder suspects. You would have to knock off an infinite number of murder suspects to show that Adam is the murderer. The only way to do that is to have evidence that Adam is the murderer. And the reason why I say that there's an infinite number of alternatives to theism is because these are just ideas that we have created. Theoretically, there are infinite possibilities when it comes to ideas. In practicality, humans are big dum-dums, so maybe not. But in theory, we could create infinite ideas.
It seems to me that Planer has made a mistake with his analogy here. Planer asks us to consider an event, the roll of a dice, and a hypothesis, that the outcome of this roll is a 6. Then he asks us to consider a second event, a second roll of that dice, and a second hypothesis, that this second roll lands on a 6. Then he notes that because the events are independent and the theories are independent, the probability of one doesn't affect the probability of the other. This is all true. But this has no bearing whatsoever on the case of theism versus other worldviews in the context of a necessary being. In Planer's case, we had two hypotheses that were being updated on the basis of totally independent events. But in the case of theism versus alternative worldviews, I'm asking you to update both of these worldviews on the same event, so to speak. That there is a necessary being.
Okay, it seems like Apologetics Squared completely misunderstood my analogy. The prediction of the roll of the die in this analogy actually has no bearing on the analogy. The analogy is purely about the roll of the die. Whatever you roll on the first roll doesn't change the likelihood of subsequent independent rolls. Likewise, the likelihood of one hypothesis doesn't change the likelihood of another hypothesis.
In fact, I would say that the more specifics that you add that you cannot show, for example, the necessary being having a mind, the more damaging that is to your argument. Why is this? Well, it's because of Occam's razor. You're adding more and more assumptions that you cannot show to be true.
Yes, the simpler your theory is, the better it is. I can totally get behind this. On my channel, I've argued that you can get all the cool stuff from theism, like a mind, omnipotence, and so on, from one assumption, so to speak. We posit that there's a perfect being. So I think theism is an incredibly simple theory.
So claiming that there's a perfect being isn't necessarily a single assumption. You have to assume that perfection is possible. You have to assume that perfection is even possible with a mind. You have to assume that perfection has some kind of objective standard that goes beyond any God standard, and you have to assume that something imperfect can come from a perfect being. Turns out that that one assumption is actually hiding a lot of other assumptions. Flat earthers do the same thing. They claim that the globe assumes that Earth is a globe, that it's spinning, that gravity is real, that water can bend, that people are hanging off the bottom of the globe. They make up all these assumptions for the globe. Then they say that the only assumption you need for a flat Earth is that the Earth is flat and stationary. Well, that is two assumptions, but it hides a lot of other assumptions by just framing it as that. They have to assume that relative density is a force, they have to assume that somehow two celestial poles are possible on a flat disk, and they have to assume that all the governments of the world are lying to them. The deeper you dive into it, the more assumptions that you find. But anyway, I think this is a good place to end the video. There was a little bit of trickiness with making this video because there is a problem when you respond to responses to responses. What happens is the responses tend to get longer and longer and longer unless you cut down the bits that you're responding to. Now, I normally don't put a link to the video I'm responding to in the description, but I'm going to make an exception here, on the condition that nobody harasses Apologetics Squared. And there's the fact that Apologetics Squared was pretty polite, and I respect that. But anyway, leave a like and subscribe if you liked that video. Leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to see me do for future videos. As always, a big shout out to my $20 or more patrons: Hugh Jarsz, M.C.Nutkin, SHaKie, Jett Alone, Nathaniel Muller, Vermont1777, Wolfie, Morrie, Graymore Ghost, KidVicious, Sacha Campbell, definitely not NASA, Craig D'Amelio, and Richard M Chapman. If you want to support me financially, you can do so on Patreon. There should be a link there. But anyway, I will see you in the next video. Between you and me, thank you for watching.